Hello, I am Aaron Munns, the Veterans Director at the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com, and welcome to part 4 of our 4-part series on asbestos-related disability claims for veteran service officers assisting veterans with asbestos claims for the VA. In segment number 4, we are going to be discussing asbestos exposure summaries. If you're looking for information about the components of asbestos diseases, including what conditions and medical diagnoses the VA recognizes, that's in part 1. The VA decision criteria, what they're looking for to approve a claim, is in part 2. Medical nexus statements for asbestos-related illnesses and diseases is part 3. And here we are in part 4. So, the important thing about asbestos exposure summaries, we discussed that the VA is looking to establish if the veteran had more exposure to asbestos during their military service on active duty than in their civilian work career before or after the military. The VA is going to look at the MOS or job rating that the veteran had on their DD-214, and that's about it. So do not assume that the VA knows how a veteran was exposed to asbestos just based on their job rating or MOS. We recommend providing a detailed summary of the 5 W's and how the veteran was exposed to asbestos, including duty location, ships, and specific equipment that they were exposed to show that they had direct contact with asbestos, were not provided with any information or protection from that asbestos exposure, and that exposure was more significant than what they experienced in their civilian work career. Buddy statements and pictures, obviously just like any other claim, are recommended if they're available. For MOS or job rating, the VA has one document, and it's out of the M21-1, Part 4. If you go to our website, to vetoutreach.com, there's a link to this. You can also go on the VA's website. Basically, the VA has a list of all the job ratings in the Navy with their probability of exposure from highly probable, probable, or minimal. Now, many Navy veterans have a minimal or probable asbestos exposure listed here, but they had a lot of exposure based on what jobs and what duties they actually performed, including time in shipyards where they performed outside of their MOS and removed and repaired and did cleanup work in areas and compartments that were covered in asbestos materials. So this is what the VA uses, and just this list. It's up to you and the veteran to show that there was a lot of exposure to get the veteran's claim approved. So asbestos exposure summaries. These are some of the questions that I ask veterans when I'm just talking to them. Number 1, do you think you had more exposure to asbestos during your service? Some guys don't know. Some are absolutely sure that they did have more exposure in service, and some are absolutely sure that they had more exposure after their service. So I like to ask this question to kind of evaluate where their knowledge of their exposure is to begin with. I like to ask them where, when, and how they were exposed to asbestos. Some guys, like I said, are able to describe specific work around asbestos materials, how they came in contact, how much exposure. They're able to describe asbestos looking like a snowstorm inside of a boiler room or an engine compartment where they were removing asbestos lagging from piping in the overheads. Others have no idea. So that's something that I can assist with. As I mentioned on a previous segment, I've worked with over 1,400 veterans on these summaries. So if you have questions or have an MOS that you're unsure of, let me know, send me an email or give me a call. I can probably help provide some information to get you started in the right direction. If they were Navy or Coast Guard, is that rating highly probable? That's a good starting point, but it's not all you need. We look at shipyard or dry dock maintenance periods. Those maintenance periods where materials are being removed and replaced is a higher period of asbestos exposure because of the nature of the work that was being done. I always ask, what type of equipment did you work with, especially for branches of service that were not aboard ship. If they were in another branch of the military or did not serve aboard ship, we want to know if they worked with vehicles that contained asbestos. All of the prime movers, both wheeled vehicles and tracked vehicles across the branches, all had some asbestos materials throughout the 1970s and all the decades beforehand. Fixed wing aircraft and rotary wing aircraft also had asbestos. Gaskets, wiring harnesses, engine insulation blankets. There was lots of asbestos on the vehicles. The military used it freely, up to and including the asbestos middens that were issued as BII for spare vehicle or spare barrel bags for crew-served weapons across the services. I was an armor officer, and I used to use an asbestos midden as a pad if I was catching a couple minutes of nap inside the turret of my Abrams tank, and this was well after asbestos was known to be dangerous, but no one ever told me. And then I also want to know if they worked outside of their MOS or on work details or during maintenance. Sometimes you'll have a veteran who worked on a sergeant major's detail or a post detail, cleaning up or repairing or preparing a building for demolition, or removing asbestos insulation from enlisted housing or family housing on a base. So we want to know all those different things that they may have done where they could have been exposed. And then we also want to know what type of work they did before and after their military service. We want to establish if they worked in a high exposure job like construction, auto mechanic, steel mill, oil fields. If they worked in a environment which had likely asbestos exposure, then we really need to focus on differentiating their military exposure from their civilian exposure. We also want to know if they received any training or personal protective equipment for handling asbestos either in their service or in their civilian career. And I'll explain why that's important. We want to try to calculate asbestos exposure if there's civilian exposure. We don't need to just show how they were exposed in the military. We have to show that they had more cumulative exposure in the military. The VA primarily just looks at the number of years. 4 years of active duty, 10 years of working for an automobile dealer or in the construction field. They're going to say you had more exposure as a civilian because the number of years are greater. But not all exposure is equal. And this is how we want to illustrate it to the VA. For example, a year aboard a Navy ship, you're exposed 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's over 8,000 hours of exposure. Versus working a year in a Ford factory, 50 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, that's about 2,000 hours of exposure. So a year aboard a Navy ship is equivalent to over 4 years of work as a civilian. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration also passed asbestos regulations lowering the permissible exposure limit to asbestos beginning in 1971 through 1986. Each year lowered that permissible exposure limit. And many civilian workers received training beginning in the early 1980s about asbestos. The asbestos materials in factories and on job sites were labeled, and the workers who needed to work with that material were given training and PPE. This was because in the early 1980s, the liability was taken away from the asbestos manufacturers. You've all seen the commercials on TV about the lawsuits. In the early 1980s, that was put on the employers. And the civilian employers did not want to be responsible when an employee got sick decades later and they got sued. So many civilian employers instituted strict asbestos exposure limits to prevent that. And many veterans received training and no longer had exposure to asbestos after the early 1980s. So a veteran had exposure in the military from 72 to 76, worked in a factory where they had full exposure from 76 to 81, and then they received training and worked in that factory for another 25 years. Really, you're only looking at about 5 years of civilian exposure, and you can show that 4 years in the military had much more exposure than those 5 years in a factory, and can explain that you don't have to look at that full 25-year work history at the factory for exposure. You're really looking at the point until they received training and PPE. Some of the key phrases that I put in every single asbestos exposure summary starts with this first paragraph: regardless of the branch of service, never being informed about the dangers of asbestos, and no breathing protection being supplied. And then the second paragraph helps head off the VA's number one reason for denying these claims, being that there was no diagnosis or record on the veteran's active duty medical records about complaining about an asbestos disease or a lung condition. And it's taken straight out of the M21-1R, where they say many people with asbestos-related diseases have only recently come to medical attention because of the latent period for development of disease due to exposure to asbestos ranges up to 45 years or more between first exposure and development of disease. When I first started doing this about 6 years ago, I had several claims denied because the VA said the veteran was not diagnosed while they were on active duty. So I started putting this in all of the statement in support of claims, and I haven't had one kicked back in several years after I started doing this. So I recommend putting this in any asbestos-related claim that you're working with. If you have questions about exposure summaries or any of the content on the previous 3 segments, please contact our free help center. I work with VSOs around the country. I've done training for 14 different states around the country, and as COVID lessens, I hope to continue to do that. So if you are a training coordinator for your state and would like to schedule me to come out to a state training conference, please let me know. I'll come out free of charge, provide materials to your VSOs. Please share this training, share the website. If there's anything that I can do to help, please think of me as a resource. Like I said in one of the previous segments, I'm an Army veteran myself. I've been a VA accredited claims agent for almost the past 6 years here at this free help center. If there's anything that we can do to help, please let me know. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.